More hostages and Palestinian prisoners released as Israel's truce with Hamas is extended by a day, minutes before it was due to expire.
The COP28 climate conference kicks off in Dubai, promising 2 weeks of fierce negotiations over the phasing out of fossil fuels. The UN's nuclear watchdog warns that the dangers around Ukraine's nuclear power plants are multiplying.
Member States and the European Parliament reach an agreement on an anti-SLAPP law aimed at defending journalists and other critical voices against abusive legal proceedings.
More Palestinian prisoners have been welcomed back to the occupied West Bank. This latest exchange came before an extended truce deal with Gaza's Hamas militant group was continued for another day, minutes before it was set to expire. 30 individuals were released by the Israeli prison services, 16 minors and 14 women. Earlier, 16 Israeli hostages were handed over to the Red Cross. Palestinian Islamic Jihad claims to have been part of the handover, apparently confirming that not all the 240 hostages seized on the 7th of October are being held by Hamas. Israel has also been informed that 3 hostages, a mother and her 2 young children, including a 10-month-old baby, were killed in an Israeli bombing of Gaza. Israel says it's investigating the claim. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been meeting survivors of the Hamas attack. The group crossed the border on the 7th of October, killing 1,200 people in Israel and taking about 240 others hostage. Netanyahu has pledged to bring back all those abducted. Meanwhile, aid agencies fear that if further truce talks fail, the resumption of Israel's attack on Hamas will lead to an even deeper humanitarian crisis among Palestinians. Save the Children says it will try to continue providing what it described as basic relief aid, bottled water, food and essential medicines, but said it's not enough. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken arriving in Tel Aviv, his 3rd visit to the region since Israel's war with Hamas began. Speaking to Israeli President Isaac Herzog, he praised progress in the release of hostages and the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gazans.
This process is producing results. It's important, and we hope that it can continue. Thank you.
Earlier Thursday, Israel and Hamas agreed to extend their ceasefire by another day, just minutes before it was set to expire.
Gives me great pleasure.
Sami Shukri, the president of last year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, announcing the opening of COP28 in Dubai, where UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is expected to deliver an urgent appeal. In an interview with AFP, Guterres said the time for slowing down is over.
The only thing that is still lacking is political will. And, I mean, this is why the COP is important, to make people understand that we are really moving in a very wrong direction still. We are heading, if nothing happens, to 3 degrees, and 3 degrees would be a total disaster.
Earlier this week, Guterres joined the annual UN and African Union conference in New York. He stressed the 2 bodies must work together on African-led solutions for African problems.
For that, for instance, we need to have a massive support to Africa. There is an absurdity. Africa has 60% of the solar capacity, and Africa has 2% of solar investment. So we need to create a global solar alliance for Africa.
Back in the Arab Emirate, activists gathered in support of vegan food policies. According to researchers, people who follow a plant-based diet generate 75% less greenhouse gas emissions a day than their meat-eating counterparts. An embarrassing slapdown for the German government after it lost a case on Thursday brought by environmental groups DUH and Bund for failing to comply with its own climate laws. More specifically, the 2 NGOs say Chancellor Olaf Scholz's traffic light coalition has not done enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transport and construction sectors.
Die Bundesregierung muss jetzt sofort Programme ausarbeiten und vorlegen und beschließen, die dann bindend sind, und zwar insbesondere im Bereich Verkehr und im Bereich Gebäude.
The Berlin-Brandenburg Administrative Court has ordered the government to adopt an immediate action programme. The Bundestag can appeal the decision, but it's a heavy burden for the Chancellor to carry to Dubai for COP28. Scholz is already dealing with a budget crisis. Berlin now plans to slash its greenhouse gas emissions by 65% by 2030, compared to 1990s levels. Christmas is coming, the goose is getting fat, and inflation in the Eurozone is expected to stand at 2.4%. That's according to a flash estimate released by the EU statistics agency Eurostat. It says food, alcohol and tobacco prices have dropped 0.5%, but energy costs have only fallen 0.3%. If these figures are confirmed, it will mark a 5-point drop compared to September. This comes a month after the European Central Bank halted a 10-month consecutive rise in interest rates.
While the short-term outlook remains subdued, the economy is set to strengthen again over the coming years as inflation falls further, household real incomes recover, and the demand for euro area exports picks up.
Hungary has the highest level of inflation across the Eurozone at 9.6%. Belgium, Italy and Finland, on the other hand, are in deflation, all coming in under 1%.
The dangers around Ukraine's nuclear power plants are increasing, according to the Atomic Energy Agency's Director General, Rafael Grossi. The proximity of fighting and power cuts to Ukraine's main plant at Zaporizhia is of particular concern. The nuclear boss made the comments during a visit to Bure in eastern France.
Il y a un tas de dangers qui se multiplient et qui sont là jusqu'à la fin du conflit, j'imagine. Donc on essaye par notre présence continue de mitiger un peu, d'avoir un effet dissuasif sur les uns et les autres pour éviter qu'à la misère de cette guerre, on ajoute un accident avec des conséquences radiologiques, n'est-ce pas?
Meanwhile, winter's ice grip is tightening on frontline soldiers near Bakhmut and Kupiansk. Kupiansk has been ravaged twice in the war, leaving a grim picture of total destruction. Moving to Bakhmut, Sergeant Roman and his unit have endured months in a bunker. The snow has given way to a biting cold on the outside, but inside, amidst the darkness, it's possible to feel relatively safe.
Мені отут взагалі комфортно, п'ятизіркові. Ті апартаменти п'ятизіркові.
But above ground, only tree stumps remain. Everything is broken and burnt. Elsewhere, the Russian Ministry of Defense has released footage of its troops firing at Ukrainian targets. Russian forces have ramped up attacks in eastern Ukraine, appearing to make territorial gains before the end of the year.
Slap. In the future, we will hear this word more and more, which covers a complicated phenomenon: strategic lawsuits against public participation. The victims of these are usually journalists, employees of civil organisations and activists, and the lawsuits are typically initiated by large companies and politicians. The final position on the regulation proposed by the European Commission has now been agreed upon by Member States and the European Parliament.
Democracy cannot work without a free and independent media. This is why the Commission welcomes the political agreement reached by the European Parliament and the Council early this morning at 2:30 a.m. on the new EU rules to protect those targeted with strategic lawsuits against public participation, or as we call them, SLAPs.
The purpose of such lawsuits is to dissuade the sued person or entity from revealing connections and cases of suspected corruption in lengthy proceedings. Last year, 160 such cases were identified in the EU. The lead MEP on the topic says he's satisfied with the result.
Cross-border cases are covered by this new law, and we offer a high level of protection for journalists. They can claim also damages, for example, and there is an accelerated procedure in cases of manifestly unfounded cases. So the court proceeding can stop very quickly. This will save a lot of money, a lot of resources, and will help journalists in defending against SLAP cases.
It's important that Member States will not recognise unfounded or abusive judgments made outside the EU. The application of the new law must begin in 2 years' time. The European car industry is asking policymakers for a comprehensive industrial strategy and a reduction in the pace of new regulations over the next 5 years. They say otherwise the sector will find itself in a tough competitive position globally. The policy recommendations were part of a manifesto and roadmap by the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, unveiled at a press conference in Brussels. The strategy must encompass all steps of the green and digital supply chains, according to the organisation's president, Luca Di Maio, who's also CEO of Renault.
I think we have a big idea. This is the Green Deal. And now we have to operationalize this thing, and we have to define, targets are defined, and we have to also decide on, who does what into this thing, who takes the responsibility based on which rules.
Di Maio is particularly critical of the slow pace at which charging stations for electric vehicles are being established across the European Union. He says that if Europe is to keep up with China, the number of installations need to be increased by a factor of 7 to 10.
That thing cannot go completely on our shoulder. We can't do that alone as an automotive industry, because it's like, like 100 and more than 100 years ago, if they would have asked us to, to control all the distribution of oil and gas. We didn't, right? So our job is to manufacture product, to develop technology, but we need to cooperation with others to do that.
The association also came out against the heavy regulatory burdens it's facing. Right now, the sector is confronted with 8 to 9 EU regulations coming into force every year until 2030, some of them conflicting. Looking ahead to next year, the European Automobile Manufacturers Association is forecasting a slowdown in new car sales compared to 2023, although the share of electric vehicles will sharply increase.